Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the discussion of anti-Semitism in the Middle East. I am not Jacob Dalal, I'm Izabella Tabarovsky. Jacob has asked me to step in at the last moment, and I'm delighted to do that. We have a wonderful panel and a wonderful discussion. Because I'm a last-minute substitution, I'm gonna ask our speakers to introduce themselves. So if you could please, we're gonna start with Lynn. If you could please say your name, say where you are, where you belong, and just a couple sentences about your background, and then we'll go into your presentation. Each speaker will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion.
So I don't go there yet. I don't go there now.
You want to?
Yeah, because I need.
Yeah, go ahead. Okay.
Exactly.
Perfect. So if we could have Lynn's PowerPoint ready, please. Okay, thank you.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes. No. Yes. Good. Okay, so my name is Lynn Julius, and I'm very happy to be here. And I am the daughter of Iraqi Jewish refugees who arrived in this country in 1950. I am a journalist, and I'm the founder of an organization called Harif, which is the UK Association of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. And we are there to raise awareness of the little-known history and culture of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. I've also written a book called Uprooted, How 3,000 Years of Jewish Civilization in the Arab World Vanished Overnight. And that is available on Amazon and other good sources. So my presentation today is on the subject of did the Zionists cause the exodus of Iraqi Jews? So why have the 140,000 Jews of Iraq, the 2,600-year-old Babylonian community, the oldest Jewish diaspora, dwindled to 3 people today? The vast majority left in 1950-51 when the Iraqi government passed a law in March 1950 permitting legal immigration on condition the Jews forfeited their citizenship. Most historians agree that the causes of the exodus were intolerance of minorities, anti-Semitic persecution, and lethal violence. So I'll just... Right. But one historian in particular has been giving oxygen to the claim that the Zionists committed false flag operations, namely bombings in 1950-51, to make the Jews leave. In his book, 3 Worlds, Memoirs of an Arab Jew, Avi Schleim accuses the Zionists of unleashing the events leading up to the departure of 105,000 Jews for Israel. So how credible are Schleim's claims? And how does his hypothesis square with an amply documented history of anti-Jewish persecution? Avi Schleim is an emeritus Oxford professor, a historian and author who has carved out a reputation as a contrarian and critic of Israel. 3 Worlds is a personal memoir set in the 3 worlds of his childhood and teenage years and his adult life in Britain. So the 3 worlds are Iraq, where he was born, Israel, where he grew up, and Britain, where he now lives. The book is elegantly and colourfully written. It details the displacement of Schleim's wealthy and comfortable family from Iraq to Israel when Schleim was 5. Schleim admits that rising anti-Semitism influenced his family's decision to leave. In fact, Jews were exposed to a rising tide of pro-Nazi anti-Semitism as early as the 1930s. Jewish civil servants were dismissed, albeit temporarily. Mr. Levy wrote this letter to the Manchester Guardian in 1934, complaining that the Jewish press was being muzzled in Iraq and people were not free to express themselves. As a historian, Schleim could not fail to document the oppression of the Jews, but he glosses over the worst example of anti-Semitism in 20th century Iraq, the Farhud massacre of 1941. Almost 200 Jews were murdered, over 500 homes and businesses were looted and wrecked, and over 1,000 people injured. There was terrible looting, mutilation, and rape. By the way, Schleim's family were not directly affected. But for Schleim, the Farhud was an aberration. Any anti-Semitism was imported from Europe. Schleim writes, Iraq was a land of pluralism and coexistence. Unlike Europe, in Iraq there was an old tradition of religious tolerance. The overall picture was one of religious tolerance, cosmopolitanism, peaceful coexistence, and fruitful interaction. In the late 1940s, persecution, especially of Zionists and communists, intensified in response to the imminent establishment of the Jewish state. Zionism was criminalized, and Jews as a whole were hostages to the First Arab-Israeli War. Jews had been sacked from their jobs and arbitrarily arrested as would-be spies. Vast sums were extorted from the rich. Jews were shaken by the execution of Iraq's wealthiest and best-connected non-Zionist Jew, Shafiq Ades. If he could be executed, what fate would befall them? And there was always the fear that another Farhud might break out. In 1949, Iraq was hemorrhaging about 1,000 Jews a month. They were being smuggled over the border with Iran. It was to stem this tide that the Iraqi government passed a law in March 1950, and here you see the law, the Citizen Waiver Law, it was known, passed in March 1950, legalizing emigration on condition that Jews renounced their Iraqi citizenship. The law was in force for 1 year only. The government thought only about 7,000 Jews would register. As it turned out, almost the entire community did so. The coup de grace came a year later when the Iraqi parliament passed a second law, freezing Jewish assets and property. The Mossad sent agents back to Iraq to organize an airlift to Israel. They reached a secret deal with the Iraqi government to arrange for planes to ferry Jews initially to Cyprus, and from May 1951 directly to Lydda Airport in Israel. By the time the law legalizing immigration from Iraq had expired, 95% of the 140,000 member community had registered to leave by airlift to Israel. Schleim gives the impression that registration to leave was a matter of choice, an optional exit strategy. But historian Esther Meir-Glitzenstein affirms that registration was irrevocable, a decision not to be taken lightly. The departing Jews had their passports stamped with this, Rocha bela raj'a, one way, no return, a de facto expulsion. The central argument in Schleim's memoir is expounded in chapter 7. It is that cruel Zionism was behind bombs aimed at Jewish or foreign targets. He alleges that these played some part in causing the exodus. In other words, Zionism was as guilty as Arab nationalism of uprooting Iraq's 2,600-year-old Jewish community. So, what bombings are we actually talking about? There were 5 incidents. Still today, it is uncertain who planted the bombs. 3 of the 5 bombs occurred in March, May, and June 1951 and caused little damage and no casualties. Well, actually, the first one, the March one, did cause a few injuries. 2 Zionist activists were hanged for planting them, Yusuf Basri and Shalom Saleh. Shalom. Schleim says that it is indisputable that the bombs did influence the Jews' decision to leave the country. At this point, we should ask, cui bono, who benefits? Schleim is not the first to claim that Israel had a motive to encourage the exodus. There were 3 groups who lent credibility to Schleim's theory. The first group is the Arabs. There's the claim that Israel needed the Iraqi Jews as a source of cheap labor. And this has become a staple, the bombing story has become a staple of Arab propaganda, and it's been fueled by anti-Zionist writers, both Arab and Jewish. The second group is the British. The British Foreign Office reported that it was plausible that certain Jews carried out the attacks, I quote, in order to focus the attention of the Israeli government on the plight of the Jews, end quote. And the third group were the Jews themselves. Zionist envoys had promised the Iraqi Jews they'd find a better life in Israel. And in reality, these Jews were in for a massive disappointment. They were sent to live in transit camps or ma'abarot, tent cities with no electricity, running water, or basic sanitation. So miserable were the conditions that Jews themselves blamed the Mossad for deceiving them into coming to Israel by planting the bombs. But not a single Jew had actually witnessed a Mossad operative planting any bombs. There were 2 commissions of inquiry into the bombs in Israel, and both absolved the Mossad's Iraqi operation of any responsibility. And in 1973, an Israeli magazine was sued for accusing the leading Mossad operative, Mordechai Ben Porat, of planting the bombs, and he won his case for libel. So let's examine the bombings in detail. Schleim says that the first incident was a bombing of the US Information Service building, which was frequented by Jews, in March 1950. In fact, there was no such bombing. The bombing of this venue actually occurred a year later. Was this a careless error, unbecoming of a serious historian, or was it what some have called a brazen chronological forgery? Remember, the citizenship waiver law came into effect on the 9th of March 1950. Schleim is falsifying the timeline to make it appear that the first incident preceded the surge of Jews registering to leave. In fact, The Zionist movement had discouraged registration, thinking the law was a trap. It only gave the go-ahead on the 9th of April, 1950. The first, go back a bit. The first bombing was actually on the 8th of April, 1950, at the Al-Beda Cafe, which was popular with Jews. Several people were injured. All the evidence for the bombing points to the nationalist Istiklal Party as the culprit. An Istiklal member confessed, as you can see, to an Iraqi historian, Shamal Abdul Qadir, that he planted the first bomb in April 1950. Schleim does not dispute that the April bombing was carried out by a Muslim. The next bombing was the fatal bombing on the 14th of January 1951. A grenade was hurled into the Mas'ouda Shem Tov synagogue, and this served as a center for registration of groups of Jews heading for the airport. The grenade hit a high-tension cable, and up to 5 Jews were killed, depending which version you read. 3 people, 4 people, or 5 people were killed, and more than 20 were injured. Who done it? The evidence points to the fact that this was also by non-Jews. The Israeli new historian Tom Segev produced evidence blaming the synagogue bombing on Iraqi nationalists. But Schleim finds a way to blame the Zionists. He charges that a police report of the time claims that the Zionists bribed the Muslim perpetrator. Schleim unearths a one page of this smoking gun, a dubious police report blaming the Zionists, but the Iraqi police are hardly paragons of integrity, and the report says nothing about bribery, nor anything specific about the Mas'ouda Shem Tov synagogue. And it is a mystery why the Zionists might have thought it necessary to bomb Jews who were queuing up outside a registration center. Now, this is a very important chart designed by David Bassoon and based on statistics from the British. By late 1950, there was a backlog of 86,000 Jews who had already registered to leave for Israel, and only 23,000 had been airlifted out. The rest were stranded in Iraq. Israel could not get them out fast enough. Levi Eshkol of the Jewish Agency is on record as saying that if the Iraqi Jews came, they would have to live on the street. Israel did not have enough tents. In any case, at that time, Israel was giving priority to Holocaust survivors, Romanian and Polish Jews. But Ben-Gurion had told Mossad to bring the Iraqi Jews quickly. There was no knowing when the gates of emigration would slam shut once more. But you can see from this chart, it shows you the explosions, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it also tells you the rate of registration that had reached nearly 90,000 by the time of the only fatal bomb in January 1951. So only about 10,000 more Jews registered after that point, and then the law expired on the 9th of March, 1951. The pressure for the Jews to leave was actually coming not from the Zionists, but from the Iraqis. the Prime Minister, Nouri Said, was so desperate to get rid of the Jews that he proposed dumping these Jews on Israel's border with Jordan. King Abdullah of Jordan flatly refused to allow this. Nouri Said had also to be dissuaded by the British ambassador from placing the Jews in detention camps in the Kuwaiti desert because Israel was not shipping them out fast enough.
So two more minutes.
2 more minutes, yeah. Yet to make his controversial thesis fit, Schleim tells a scandalous falsehood in his book. He maintains that the registration deadline was extended from March to July 1951, encompassing the last 3 bombings of March, May, and June 1951. Yosef Basri and Shalom Saleh Shalom were both accused of these last 3 bombings and executed in January 1952. They were not accused of the fatal bombing of the Masuda Shem Tov synagogue. Basri and Shalom confessed to having been responsible for the 3 bombings subsequent to Masuda Shem Tov. And these confessions were extracted under terrible torture. But even if Basri and Shalom were guilty, these bombings are irrelevant. The deadline for registration had already passed on the 9th of March, 1951. If we examine the full weight of evidence, the bombs were not what caused Jews to flee Iraq. They feared a second Farhud. Plus, many had lost their jobs. They were being harassed and intimidated. The historian Esther Meyer Glitzenstein found that in memoirs by those who left Iraq, the bombings were not cited as a reason for their flight. None of them points to the terrorist incidents as a motive, she writes. My parents left Iraq in July 1950. When I asked my father whether their departure had been influenced by bombs, he said, "What bombs?" Even Schleim concedes, we felt vulnerable because we were Jews. Schleim has garnered much praise for his memoir, not just from the Arab and pro-Arab press, but from mainstream media, such as The Spectator and the Financial Times. He even won a literary prize. The media have been seduced by a conspiracy theory which blames the Jews for their own misfortune. What makes him so dangerous is that Schleim is a respectable academic. His status as what he calls an Arab Jew and as an avuncular Oxford professor lends authority to what he writes. He's not the only one to rewrite the facts to malign Israel and whitewash anti-Semitism and spread the myth of peaceful coexistence between Jews and Arabs before the establishment of Israel. And he trades on general ignorance, an ignorance which we must do everything to dispel. To answer the question, did the Zionists cause the Exodus? The answer is no. As Simon Sharma said, anti-Semitism caused Zionism and not the other way around. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lynn. Our next speaker is John Strawson, who will speak about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in the Arab world, looking back from October 7th, 2023. John, please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm John Strawson. I'm Emeritus Professor of Law at the University of East London. I'm a research fellow of this center, and I was, in my former life, a visiting professor at Birzeit University in Palestine. What I want to begin with is walking through the ruins of Kibbutz Kfar Aza 6 weeks after the atrocities of October the 7th. It was, and many of you may well have also visited these communities which were attacked. Despite the fact it was 6 weeks later, you could smell the burning and you could smell death. And the level of violence was fairly clear from the devastation, particularly of the area where the young people had lived, where clearly excessive violence had been used in order to prevent young people from building their own lives. And of course, we're talking of Jews. And inevitably, as one walked along these paths, past devastated houses, one reflected on how we had got to this state when the Hamas program, and Hamas was the main organizer of this atrocity, in plain sight makes it very clear that it is an anti-Semitic genocidal organization. And what was extraordinary about that was, as I was walking along, hearing my footsteps on the pavements, I reflected also that my footsteps would have sounded like those of the Hamas attackers. Just like when I visited Anne Frankhuis in Amsterdam, I realized when I walked up the stairs, the wooden stairs, that one of the enduring memories of the book is her fear of hearing heavy boots going up the stairs. And so one realized at that point that the sound of one's own feet have some physical connection to the kind of atrocities which have taken place. And that stirred in me a memory of when I was at Birzeit University, where I taught between 1996 and 2006. And going one day into the engineering building, I suddenly realized that in front of the building was a mural on the pavement, on the floor. And it was a mural of images of the victims of Sbarro pizza attack by Hamas in Jerusalem, which took place in 2001. And what you were invited to do is to step over the bodies of the dead victims. And that, of course, stirred in my own experience a question of what was the depth of anti-Semitism within the Arab world? Because here was the most dehumanizing form of street theater. I was told by the authorities in the university this was student excessive behavior. This was not something which should be punished, but it was just exuberance. The exuberance, the jouissance of anti-Semitism. And of course, after October the 7th, a great deal of attention has been paid to the relationship between Hamas and the impact of Nazism on the Arab world. And undoubtedly, the work which Matthias Kunzel has done and Jeffrey Hirth has been extremely important in enlightening that historical relationship. But this also stirred in me another memory, a memory of reading the debates at the United Nations over the partition plan in 1947, and reading the accounts and the verbatim accounts of the contributions of many of the Arab leaders. Faraz Khouri, who was to become the highest Syrian Christian ever to become prime minister. his associate from Syria, Adil Arslan, and also the Iraqi, and we've just been talking about Iraq, the Iraq representative, Mohammed Faidal al-Jalani, all of whom had a very similar view of the Jews. Now, these politicians, I hasten to point out, were not Nasserites. It's before the Nasser Revolution. They were largely operating within a British sphere of influence or a French sphere of influence, a Western sphere of influence. They were not communists. They had no known links with Nazism. But as Amir Arslan says in one of his contributions, pointing to the United States, he says, "What do you want? Do you want hundreds of thousands of communists," because of course Jews are communists to arrive in Palestine, or is your aim to have a large number of Jews swarming in Palestine? He also said this is quite clearly, the partition debate was a conspiracy against the Arab world. And both Khoury and Jamali make a very big point that this is not a real debate that's taking place in the United Nations, but one which is being pressurized by Jewish influence, first in the United States, and then taking over the United Nations. So that the result of the vote, which is eventually, of course, as we know, was in favor of partition into two states within an economic union and internationalization of Jerusalem, when that took place, this was evidence that the conspiracy had worked. The vote was not free because the Zionists and the Jews, through their control of the United States, were actively pressurizing all the delegates, the 33 who voted in favor, in order to vote. And this struck me as, in my memory, as I was walking through Kibbutz Kfar Aza, it struck me as something quite important, that it wasn't just extremists within the Arab world where we find anti-Semitism. It isn't just as a result of Nazism. And there was a very high degree of influence of Nazism, particularly in the Muslim Brotherhood, and then, of course, as we know, in the Palestinian national movement, and as we just heard, in Iraq. But it was also within this more moderate. Have someone who was touted as a great moderate in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, Mahmoud Abbas, the president of Palestine, who, of course, was courted particularly by the left, including the Israeli left, in the 1990s, as the great hope of securing a two-state solution. But of course, President Abbas's PhD thesis is precisely on the way in which Nazism assisted, Zionism assisted Nazism. And he says in his PhD, quite extraordinary things, only 1 million Jews died. Only 1 million. And of course, more recently, in his speech to the Command Council of Fatah, the ruling party in the West Bank, he returned to some of these themes of the conspiracies of the Jews, of what had taken place, was that you could not trust Jews, which of course reflects precisely the views of Khoury, Jalami, and also of Arslan. Now, what's interesting about those three politicians is they all come from different confessional groups. Khoury is a Christian. Interestingly, he is comes from a Greek Orthodox family which converted to Presbyterianism. Amir Aslan, who is a noble, the Emir is not a name, it's a title, comes from the Druze community, but they converted to Sunni Islam. And Jalani comes from a very well-known Shia family, but he converted to Sunni Islam in order to marry his American wife. And that, I think, is quite interesting, that we're not just talking about a group of people who come from one particular background within the Arab politics, that what we're actually facing with, that we are faced with, in my view, is much deeper roots of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, which was part of the growth of the Arab national movement. Perhaps one of the founding texts was by Najib Azuri, which he published in French, about the Arab revival within Turkish Asia, in which one of his main concerns is the universal Jewish peril. This is published in 1905. And he goes on to explain that there's a big problem taking place. This is, of course, decades before the creation of the State of Israel, a decade before and more of the Balfour Declaration or of the Mandate. He says the problem is that we, the Arabs, nationalists, have to act very quickly because the Jews are going to create a nationalism which will dominate our world unless we act very fast. And it's interesting because that attitude is also represented by Huri, this Syrian future prime minister, in 1947, when he makes a speech in Syria in which he says, we have to work fast. This is, of course, just before the declaration of the State of Israel. We have to work fast to prevent this. He said, they may have the money, but we have the brains. Repeating, of course, the anti-Semitic trope about Jews and money. So what I suppose I am trying to suggest is that the question and the work which we need to do on anti-Semitism in the Arab world is very serious. To some extent, I lived in Cairo for a while, and I was very aware that on the bookstores there was Mein Kampf in Arabic translation. Fortunately, the editions that I passed seemed to be very dog-eared, and I don't think were bought by many people, but the fact that they were there was very significant. And that I totally accept is a very serious question. But it seems to me it is within the warp and weft of the development of Arab nationalism that particular attitude towards Jews has given the ground for why it was that Nazism was quite well received amongst certain circles within the Arab nationalism. In other words, there's a prior history which we need to understand, one which many scholars tried to work on, like Bernard Lewis, for example. But of course, Bernard Lewis became unfashionable, pushed aside by Simon Sharma's frenemy, I think he described Edward Said yesterday, who, by the way, I think his acolytes completely misrepresent what he said, and he's not quite as terrible as he might appear in some of the versions of those people who think they're keeping his flame alive. I think he's a more interesting, complex person, but nonetheless, he was able, through his position, to sideline people like Bernard Lewis, who I think were trying to tell us something quite important. And this has a practical implication for any realistic approach to the question of a two-state solution, because it was anti-Semitism which stopped the two-state solution in 1947. Don't forget, the partition plan did not propose that any single person had to move their home. No one had to lose their property. Everyone could stay exactly where they were. There were to be constitutions in both states which guaranteed democracy, proportional representation, and minority rights under the rule of law.
2 more minutes, please.
And, of course, this was to be within an economic union. A very imaginative plan, which was rejected by the Palestinian and Arab nationalist movements, and which, of course, resulted in the turn to war in 1948, which had already begun with the Arab League Military Committee already operating forces inside British Mandate Palestine from the beginning of 1948. And that turn to violence in 1948 was a turn to violence because of the refusal to accept that Jews have the right of self-determination. And all these speeches in 1947 from the Arab and Islamic world were aimed at trying to show that either Jews were not Jews, or that Jews in the past had been disruptive in the Middle East in antiquity, or that they had terrible ambitions, and that what the big problem was, said Amir Aslan, is that out of this conspiracy will come an attempt at Jewish domination. I think we need to integrate some of this understanding into how we think about the strategy for a solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Thank you for your attention.
John, thank you very much. Our next speaker is Amira Halperin, who will talk about the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, UNRWA, institutional and global anti-Semitism. And here's...
Thank you, Oksana. How does it work here? Is this? It's okay. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay, great. Thank you very much. Is it okay? Yeah, everybody already? Hold tight to your seats and enjoy the show. My name is Dr. Amira Halperin, Senior Research Associate of Britain, Israel and Communication Research Center, Biocom in London, as well as working in academia as an academic scholar with ISGAP, and a member of Forum Dvorah, which is based in Israel, but it consists of different aspects of research that women are working on. The idea is to include women from different areas of security and policy research, including scholars, but also ambassadors and policymakers, to work together and to develop research in these areas and, of course, policy. I conducted my PhD research at University of Westminster. I did my PhD for 6 years. I was traveling around here in the UK to interview Palestinians, both from Hamas and Fatah. And I know who is who because I've been invited to different events and conferences of Hamas and Fatah, so I knew how to differentiate between them, even though, of course, as a media professor, the book and the research is not based on political aims and is not based on politics or it doesn't mean that if you interview Hamas, you would necessarily understand you would necessarily discuss the politics behind it, but obviously I knew who am I talking with. I considered to be the first Israeli who gained access to the Palestinian diaspora in the UK and interview this community. Following the completion of PhD, I conducted a postdoctorate at the University of British Columbia in Canada, where I interviewed Palestinian and but mostly also Palestinians, but mostly Syrian refugees. And previously, before my academic career, I was working as a journalist both in Israel and in the UK for BBC Panorama, investigating Hamas funding in Europe, mainly in the UK, terrorism and radicalization. Today, I will talk about the report about UNRWA that was published in December by Viacom and is a research that I conducted, of course, after October 7th, and would give you an understanding about this organization, humanitarian aid organization, as well as about Hamas terrorism and the links to the global problem of terrorism. The research that I conducted is obviously also relied and based also on my book, because I wouldn't be able to understand the gravity of the situation and understand UNRWA's role in October 7th without conducting these 300 interviews with Palestinians during my PhD research 10 years ago prior to October 7th. So that's why it's combination of this understanding and background that I bring in. So there is a new United Nations report that was published just recently, and the aim of my research is to refute the allegations against Israel that the UN is discussing and bringing to the stage. So if you can see here, our report is basically based on interviews with people that are working with the humanitarian aid in Israel, people that are really on the ground and first sources of information. So let's start with this first introduction of UNRWA. If we'll summarize what is UNRWA in one sentence, we say that UNRWA is a terrorist organization. The understanding is that UNRWA is part of the society in Gaza, so it's not only humanitarian aid, it also provides education and other services. So we all know that UNRWA is a terrorist organization because we have evidence for this, and just in few slides I provide you here with the evidence, why it relates to October 7th. UNRWA employees were actually carried out October 7th attack, and there were investigations proving it, both UNRWA's investigations and other investigations. And of course, we don't have time to look further into it, but there is this evidence. But we have to bear in mind that this problem of terrorism within UNRWA did not start on October 7th. So UNRWA was involved with terrorism before October 7th, and also if we talk about the schools, for example, UNRWA schools, we all know that the content of the textbooks is incitement for terrorism. Now I would like to go further and to talk about funding. So what I'm showing you here is the link between UNRWA and Qatar's charity, and again, it goes back before October 7th, but it's very important to remember this because it didn't start on October 7th. Qatar Charity, the main charity that is providing funding to UNRWA, is a member of this, as you see here, where is it? I don't know. anyway, it's a member of the Coalition of Good, which is a terrorist organization. So we know that when they signed this agreement with Qatar Charities, they basically signed an agreement with a terrorist organization. And here I would like to take you back to Interpol. As you all know, they also collaborated with Interpol, which is considered to be a humanitarian aid organization, but basically delivering funding from the UK to Gaza. And if we look at Interpol, this is again a case that was published in 2004 when I worked at the time for BBC Panorama. We exposed the links between Interpol, a charity based in the UK, in London, to Hamas. We all know that UNRWA is now no longer can work in Israel because of its involvement in October 7th massacre. And here is what I talked about, Interpol and the link to the Qatar charity. As you can see here, again, evidence that we have that UNRWA is linked with terrorism. And here we can see about the education aspect, again, links with terrorism. We all know that UNRWA is considered to be the main humanitarian aid in Gaza. And we all hear the criticism in the news when they hear that Israel is now no longer working with UNRWA, saying that that might lead to starvation, and the Gazans would basically are going through processes of genocide. But the reality is totally different, because UNRWA not only that is not the main provider of humanitarian aid in Gaza, but also, as I said, is a terrorist organization that preventing from the Gazan people to receive humanitarian aid. Because from interviews I conducted with the main employees in the Israeli government that in charge on these links of humanitarian aid between Gaza and Israel, I learned that Hamas, as we all know, but this is established in a very clear way, that Hamas is preventing from this humanitarian aid to be delivered to the Gazan people. So if you can see here, the main organization that actually humanitarian aid that delivers aid to Gaza is WFP and not UNRWA. UNRWA is an organization that was established many years ago with the establishment of the State of Israel to help Palestinian refugees. But here we have a major problem. Who is a Palestinian refugee? Who is a Palestinian? And this is exactly the problem that we are all aware of. Because if we look at the Palestinians, for example, here in the UK or elsewhere in Europe, we know that they consider themselves to be refugees. The Palestinians that I interviewed for my research and live here and very much integrated here in the society still call themselves refugees. The same in Gaza. We have a problem because it's very much different from other types of refugees. And we have a problem of settlement. So we know now that Trump, for example, is talking about settlement of Palestinian refugees outside of Gaza. How would it be possible if the Palestinians themselves would be reluctant to do so because they believe that they still need to keep this momentum of being refugees? They don't, if you would ask a Palestinian, for example, most of the Palestinians that I asked, if there would be a scenario where you would have a state, would you leave the UK, would you leave Europe, they would not necessarily say yes. So we have a problem here with definition. And this is the core problem because they are not really settling, and UNRWA is not really helping them to settle in other countries. Now let's look at anti-Semitism in the Palestinian context. And here I would like to talk about two levels of anti-Semitism. The first is this one. IHRA definition of anti-Semitism is being criticized by Palestinian scholars, by the Palestinian elite, because they are claiming that IHRA definition is Israel's manipulation against them. And basically, we see here, I brought to the fore here, 3 names of scholars, and I chose 3 names from different countries, US, UK, and Israel. And one of them is from Columbia, BZ, and University of Kent in the UK, just to explain to you what they feel about this definition of anti-Semitism. So they say the fight against anti-Semitism should not be turned into delegitimize the fight against the oppression of the Palestinians, the denial of their rights, and the continued occupation of their land. And this is very interesting because this letter that I have, I mean, you can't see here all the information, the documents that I have, because I put in my slides only a few links and bullet points. But of course, if someone would have an interest to look at it, I would be happy to show you. This letter of the definition has been signed by more than 50 scholars in Europe and in the US, and they are talking about the fact that anti-Semitism in the context of the Jewish society is wrong, because basically they are saying this anti-Semitism is to undermine us, the Palestinians. If we dive into this, I would like to say another thing relating to this. Here in the UK, there are 20 universities, at least, if not more, that say exactly that the problem, of anti-Semitism and the problem of collaboration with Israel is the problem of the Jewish community. And there are few here in the audience that already heard the story that I just talked about in earlier talk this morning about Coventry University, where I worked, and there are people there that are linked with these terrorism networks and so on and so forth. And in this context, it's also very important to remember that when we talk about the IHRA definition, the formal process of universities here in the UK, the formal regulation, the formalities to say that the IHRA is the right definition of anti-Semitism, and this is what should be accepted in universities. In reality, it's totally different, because management of universities basically allow, and there is no enforcement in cases where students and professors use a different definition, which is a very radical one. Another level of anti-Semitism that I would like to share with you is how the Palestinian society, how the Palestinian people themselves look at anti-Semitism. So if you hear daily conversations between Palestinians, you would hear almost on a daily basis that they use the word Holocaust and Nakba. Why they use these words? For example, when I interviewed the Palestinians, I was sitting with the mother and the son from Gaza. And I asked them my questions. And after I finished the interview, the mother approached her son. And she said to him, "Do you know, Yasser? She's talking about, the Holocaust. And I asked her, "What do you mean?" And then she said, you know, she's asking about what IDF did to us the other day. It's the Holocaust. And then they talk about the Nakba and the Naksa and so on. I learned Arabic for many years in order to understand these particularities and nuances that you have to understand when you hear them. And also when I interviewed Hamas and Fatah here in the UK, I was sitting in their offices, mosques, and whatever, and I was looking and seeing how they are perceiving the occupation, so-called. So this report that we see that was published this month, and if we look at Biocom's report that I wrote about UNRWA, that, as I said in the beginning, aims to refute these allegations. So these reports actually support this institutional anti-Semitism in the Palestinian society. If you read this report, you would understand that what they are saying, their accusations against Israel, are basically supporting this and echoes the perception of the Palestinians that I talked about, the elite who object to this definition of anti-Semitism as we all know it.
2 more minutes.
Now I interviewed the Israeli government officials and I asked them, and I've attended briefs of the Israeli government, and I've asked them, can UNRWA be replaced? So it's not a straightforward answer, and it's not a question whether UNRWA can be replaced. The most important thing for the Israeli government is to say, we are not working with terrorist organizations. So therefore, there is no question at all whether we should continue working with UNRWA or not, because we are not working with terror organizations. The second thing is that even now, as you see in the graph, UNRWA is not the main provider of humanitarian aid. There are many other organizations that can help on the ground. So the fact that we ask, can it be replaced? Yes, it can be replaced. It might take time. And the main reason is because it links also to education and other platforms, not only humanitarian aid. We see here a truck with ammunition, UNRWA's truck with ammunition, and we have evidence that actually proves that these trucks are being used to deliver ammunition, not only humanitarian aid. And we know that also if we talk about humanitarian aid, I think that one personal thing that I have to say, because I also work on a few other reports, one of them is the links between terrorists in the UK to campuses that I'm finished this report, I didn't present it yet. And another one is about the hostages. So if you look, for example, at the case of the hostages, and you heard Eli Sharabi talking, and Eli Sharabi basically said very clearly, Hamas is taking the food from the Gazans and for himself, and also prevents from the hostages food. So the situation that we all need, I think, to understand as a community and to deliver the message to the non-Jewish community is the message where Israel is dealing with a government that is a terrorist organization, because Hamas is ruling Gaza since 2007. And if we talk about UNRWA as part of the fabric of this society, of the Gazan society, we have to remember that it's not only UNRWA. And if you know, we all read that there are Gazans that also supported Hamas and helped in October 7th massacre. This is not a surprise, because Hamas is the government. So just imagine if we look at UK government, Israeli government, all the institutional, all the infrastructure is being facilitated by governments in Western democracies, right? So this is the same in Gaza. But in Gaza, it's the different case, because the government is a terrorist organization. So I think that just if you see here in my last bullet point, we have also two reports, at least two reports, but the main important one, UN Watch reports that are proving UNRWA's terrorgram and UNRWA, Hamas, and Islamic Jihad, again, proving how UNRWA is operating within this terrorism sphere for years, before October 7th, and of course, after October 7th. And UNRWA is no longer operating now in Israel. There is this ban where they can't really deliver humanitarian aid. But again, as I said, it doesn't mean, of course, that humanitarian aid will not be delivered to Gaza. Humanitarian aid has been delivered to Gaza before October 7th for many years. And of course, from October 7th on a larger scale. If you have any questions to ask, because this is a very big topic and there are many other points that I would not have time to cover now, but if you have any question to ask me about terrorism in the UK, terrorism on campuses, UNRWA, or any other topics, I'm here for you.
Thank you very much, Amira. So, do we have someone who can help us with the microphone for the questions? Is there somebody from the organizers? No. Okay, so what I'd like to do...
Can you return bring it back?
Right. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to use my privilege as a moderator to ask some questions, and then perhaps what we could do, because we do want for you to be heard, if you have a question, could you please come out here, and I will give you a microphone so that you can ask the question, and then everybody will hear, because I think it's also being recorded.
I'm really happy to go around with my...
Oh, fantastic. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so I want to start by asking, thank you, by asking Lynn, so can you explain to us the motivation behind Yossi Schlein's, what he says, and why it's so radically different from what you are describing from?
I've been following Avi Schlein for some time, actually. I've sort of monitored what he has to say about Iraqi Jews. And I think he has a big chip on his shoulder. It's to do with his dysfunctional family. What happened was when the family moved to Israel, they suffered a dramatic decline in their standard of living. The father was much older than the mother. It wasn't a particularly happy marriage. It ended in divorce. I don't think he ever got over that. And he blamed the state of Israel for the situation that the family found themselves in. And so I think he's just projecting his own personal grievances on Israel. And there may be more to it. He might be receiving funds from Qatar, you never know. But I think that's basically the problem.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for debunking everything he says. You see it a lot on social media, references to him. A question for John is, and maybe also for Amira, although I have a separate question for Amira, but this question arises from some conversations I've had recently with colleagues about, and the question of anti-Semitism in the Palestinian society or in the Arab society in general. When we talk about anti-Semitism within the Jewish community and in Israel, there is a sense that, okay, well, there is an anti-Semitism in the diaspora. It's the diaspora that suffers mostly from anti-Semitism. People don't really think of Israelis suffering from anti-Semitism, and you don't even have to, you don't have to take the kind of the far left view that, well, Hamas is decolonizing, right? This is a form of decolonization. I think in general, people don't think somehow that what's the attacks against Israelis are driven by anti-Semitism. And in fact, many, many more Israelis have died as a result of these attacks than Jews in the diaspora. So I wonder if you have any reflections on these perceptions and how we can perhaps bring them closer together, because I think right now, this difference in perceptions divides us and doesn't help us to unite diaspora and Israel in fighting against anti-Semitism.
Thank you. Well, I think that this is a very good question, and I think it's one where I have the only area where I have any agreement, I think, with Bibi Netanyahu is on this particular question. He says that this is when he was still talking about a Palestinian state, that the Palestinian national movement had to recognize the right of Jews to self-determination. And I think that is quite important. So I think that this question of the delegitimization of Jews as a people is actually the cause of the conflict. Because I ran conflict resolution classes for many years. And I always used to say that if one party doesn't recognize the legitimacy of the other to be in the conflict, which is what the Palestinian national movement in its dominant narrative has done, that is a recipe for endless conflict. And a recipe that eventually you will win if you just keep on. And that precisely is what is in the syntax of the demonstrations that we've been seeing since October the 7th, where basically people say, this is not a conflict between Palestinians and Jews. This is a conflict between colonial people rising up against oppressors who shouldn't be there in the first place. And so what's interesting, and of course this begins with the creation of the Arab League, that no normalization, first of all with Jews and Jewish economy in Mandate Palestine, this no normalization has continued, and it is all about denying Jews the right to be Jews. And it's very interesting that the BDS movement has, of course, denounced the directors of No Other Land for being a collaboration. And despite the fact it tells a story, quite a harsh story about the occupation, this apparently is in breach of the no normalization. So yes, Jews in Israel are a victim of anti-Semitism, and I think that's quite difficult for Jews in Israel, for Israelis to accept, given what the project of Israel was. And that is what has been so unsettling and traumatic about October the 7th.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And for Amira, I have the question about, I wonder, I'm sure you're familiar with the thesis that Einat Wilf has about problems that prevent a peaceful resolution, is the idea that the Palestinians have been led to believe that they have a right to return into the sovereign state of Israel. And I wonder if now that UNRWA is no longer going to be dominating the societies, will that help? Will that help to perhaps change the consciousness about the fact that the Palestinians have a right to return into the sovereign state of Israel?
Yeah. So the right of return is a term that is coined, has been coined by probably, right, the Palestinians themselves, talking about the fact that they are willing to do anything in their power to return to their homeland. Now, here we have few problems. The first problem is that after October 7th, the UK government found out that Palestine Return Center in London, in UK, is linked to terrorism. So the UK government is, at the moment, is considering, recommending, advising to proscribe the Palestinian Return Center in London. This indicates on a problem that the Palestinian community is a highly politicized community. And when I interviewed them, the prominent issue, the most important issue for them is the right of return. But it's not practically an issue that they deal with. It's more ideology. It's more ideological concern. It's more idea that gathers them together through this Palestinian nationalism, but it doesn't mean necessarily that they want to return to a land even if they would have a land. So we have also to remember that Palestine Return Center, the problem that I mentioned with terrorism, it's the main problem in our society, not only in Israel. Because if we talk about Hamas, you have to remember that Hamas is not equals to Gaza and the West Bank. Hamas is UK, Hamas is Brussels. I just returned from Brussels. I've been there last week. I delivered a speech at the European Parliament. The situation there is horrific. I don't have time to talk about it. But no, I'm not optimistic, sorry.
All right, so why don't we take, please, those who have questions, raise your hands, and let's take maybe 2 or 3 questions at a time. Who was the person with the microphone? Oh, okay, so I see some questions right here in the front. Let's take these 3, the ones that I see right here, please. So let's, okay, that's fine.
Thank you very much for all the impressive talks. I was especially fascinated by the polemic regarding Iraq, and but my question actually goes to the contemporary era, because you have mentioned that there are 3 Jews remained in Iraq. I'm surprised that there are any. I thought that no Jews have left after ISIS and things like that. Do we know something about these people, where they live? How do they live? How many synagogues do they have?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for 3 very stimulating and informative papers. My question is for Professor Strawson. You said, and I think I quote, anti-Semitism stopped the 2-state solution in 1947. Does that mean that if it had been Japanese or Italians trying to establish a state in Palestine, that would not have met with the opposition of the Palestinian community? While anti-Semitism, would it not be the case that while anti-Semitism is certainly a growing factor amongst Palestinians and in the Middle East generally, that in 1947 it was essentially a conflict between 2 peoples, each of whom was trying to achieve self-determination, and it wouldn't really have mattered whether it was Jews or Martians. The Palestinian community would have objected equally. And the related question then, wasn't the anti-Semitism not of Palestinians but of the British, of Canadians, and of the Americans after World War II, which stopped surviving Jews from continental Europe, including some of my relatives, from going there to reasonably secure lives, and instead meant that, in fact, they did end up in Palestine.
Thank you. Let's take the question here, and over there. And I'll just say, in terms of time, we started late. We're supposed to finish in 5 minutes, but if you want to stay, we started 10 minutes late. If you feel like staying an extra 10 minutes, I think we can do that, because there is a break after this. So, go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you for 3 excellent presentations. And my question is for Professor Strawson. Only yesterday, Impact SE published a report on the PA UNRWA school syllabus for the next academic year. The main theme continued to be the denial of Israel's rights to exist in stronger terms than it's been before, and this is a continuing issue. How can we persuade Western governments to stop funding the educations and the books until they actually address the issue? Because this is, as you said, the very key to solving the problem.
Thank you. The Blair government, the Starmer government, reinitiated the funding of UNRWA. Would you agree that that goes hand in hand with their support for the International Criminal Court's arrest warrant for Netanyahu, the months and months of pressure on Israel to declare a ceasefire before Hamas had been disabled? And if Netanyahu had followed that advice, of course, we wouldn't have seen the massive demonstrations by Gazans against Hamas, which is such an important Second question is, am I not right that you wrote on the Abbas doctoral thesis that John Strawson mentioned? And isn't that simply a testimony to, in actual fact, the role of the sons and daughters of Stalin in the Soviet Union, who blocked with Baath socialism, who blocked with the capitalist Arab regimes, with Nasserism, and so on and so forth, and explains why it is that, for example, the Stalinist organization, the PFLP, was a participant in October the 7th, and isn't that the legacy of Stalinism in the Arab East?
Do we have another one up?
Let's take this question, and I think this will be the round that we're going to address.
Yeah, I will be very quick. It's the point Professor Strawson made about that anti-Semitism is far from being limited to Muslim Arabs, for example. And from my personal acquaintance with Christian Arab, particularly Palestinian descent from Beirut, it has possible two roots. So it's the Christian anti-Judaism, and then in contemporary context, a fear of fundamentalism, a fear of being destroyed either by Sunni or Shia fundamentalism. And in many ways, anti-Semitism acts as a glue, as a bridge to find a place in that society where Christians are dwindling minority. So that, and so to what extent the research in anti-Semitism in Arab Middle Eastern societies should be looked at the role it plays in the context of those tensions. Yeah, so that would be a comment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So I think there was one question for Lynn, right? There was a question for Amira, several questions for John, one question for me, which I can answer quickly. Why don't we start with you?
Thank you very much. I think the reason why ISIS didn't kill those 3 Jews is because it wasn't actually in Baghdad, and that's where those Jews live, as far as I know. I may be wrong, but I think it's an old man, his nephew, and there's a girl who's a dentist. I think those are the 3. Why are they still there? Every Arab country still has a tiny remnant, or none at all, of Jews. I think that's probably as close to total ethnic cleansing as you can get. You know, don't ask for those 3 to leave. You know, they're not going to leave. There's no community, so there's no operating synagogue. There's no rabbi. There's no structure there for them. They keep their identities sort of under wraps. They're under the radar. I don't think people, you know, they don't draw attention to themselves. It would be dangerous if they did.
Why don't we go to Amira next?
Yeah, I just want you to look at this slide, please, and to understand relating to funding. Like I wrote here, UNRWA's operations and funding appeals primarily rely on contributions, and you see here 93% of the agency funding comes from UN member states and the EU, with the remainder sourced from other UN agencies, business charities, and individuals. So relating more specifically to your question, the US, right, is the only state at the moment that decided to keep this frozen their funding, and they decide to keep it. I actually, as part of my work on this research, maybe I should have mentioned this, I didn't only interview officials in Israel, I also interviewed officials here in Starmer's government. I'm very disappointed, I must say. I'm very disappointed, I must say, and I must agree with you. I don't know if we have much time to talk about my meetings here with Starmer's people, but maybe later. But more importantly, if you ask me about the Palestinian protests, my answer is also, we don't have much time for this, but I wouldn't be misled by these protests.
Which
means that we are not sure that this is genuine and We don't know yet.
That there may be other actors kind of provoking them. Okay, John.
Okay, thank you. First of all, can I congratulate the audience for being here at this time? I have to say, it's very impressive. I was asked really 4 questions. One, Jews are not the Japanese. The Japanese have not suffered centuries, millennium, of people saying they have no right to exist, or they don't exist, or they're not who they say they are. So if the Japanese had wanted to create a state in Palestine, that would have been a different question. It would have been a question of colonialism, presumably, but it would not have been a question that their identity was in any way going to be attacked. You're absolutely right. The first question was absolutely right. Of course, the ideas of the European Enlightenment precisely give root to this idea that there's something peculiar about Jews, that to become a Jew, that to be a Jew, you cannot enter the Enlightenment until you have ceased to be a Jew. It doesn't matter whether you're reading Voltaire or Karl Marx or whatever, it's the same story that Jews have to cease to be Jews. And that is absolutely true, that has a huge influence on Arab nationalism, which precisely begins to develop at the end of the 19th century, is very influenced these ideas. Azuri, who I mentioned, was very influenced by the whole debates around the Dreyfus case, and he lived in Paris. And so it was, of course, Europe. There is a transnational character of anti-Semitism. I think that's what we perhaps need to say about that. Can we prevent, how do we organize international pressure on these textbooks, which I've also heard from people I know that have been reissued in a particularly vicious way in relationship to Jews. By the way, I've seen some of the earlier iterations of these textbooks, both in Gaza and the West Bank. They are quite horrific. The big question, and the question which you mentioned about the European governments, they're all torn between a notion of humanitarianism, that they need to deliver humanitarian aid, that schools have to operate, and at the same time, whether they should in fact censor what Palestinians are saying, because they think that undermines Palestinian right to self-determination, which goes right back to where we began. So you're absolutely, you put your finger on an important question. On Christian anti-Semitism, yeah, of course, absolutely. On Christian anti-Semitism, absolutely correct. I think from the beginning, most actually, of the main leaders of the Arab nationalism were Christians. And they precisely were very concerned about their place as a minority within the Arab world. And of course, the problem for Arab nationalism is there are lots of minorities in the Arab world. Huge minorities of Kurds, Assyrians, Christians of different denominations, and of course a large number of Jews. And what you actually see is a big competition, particularly in the dying days of the Ottoman Empire, as to whether or not you project this wide Arab state from the Atlantic to the Fertile Crescent, or whether you actually think in a different sense. And of course, one of the things which phenomena was the rise of Syrian nationalism, of which Khoury was part of. And of course, it's very interesting that Khoury's notion of the nation was that Syria, of course, should control Palestine. And that is one of the big divisions which still exist within the Palestinian national movement between, are we Syrians or are we Palestinians? There is, of course, Jamal Husseini returning from the defeat of the Syrian attempt at independence in the 1920s says, we have lost Syria, now we have to fight for Palestine. And that is, that is almost the moment at which Palestinian nationalism begins to develop as a consequence of that. But I absolutely think a lot of very, very helpful questions. Thank you very much.
I think it's also important to mention here that they are referring to what you are saying is that the Palestinian and the Kurds are stateless. So if we look at it, sometimes, I mean, if we look at literature, for example, when I wrote my research, you would call it like imagined community, because they would imagine, you know, that they have a state, but they don't have a state. You look at it totally different than other countries in the Middle East, relating to Palestinian nationalism.
Thank you so much. And regarding the question of Stalinist influence, you know, I still have a little bit of a trouble with that terminology. I think it's a particularly British terminology. I just call it Soviet anti-Zionism. It's not entirely incorrect, because for sure, the anti-Zionism that arose in the USSR in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, which has been so influential in the Middle East and in the West as well, it was in many ways perpetrated by people who came out of Stalin's regime. So 20 years later, so it's not incorrect, but it's also Brezhnev's anti-Zionism. You know, it's characterized very much by this particular geopolitical interests of that era, of post-1967 era. And I think that influence was very strong, no doubt. And in general, the left has always been anti-Zionist. So the things that we're seeing today, it's just the anti-Zionism of the left has changed. After '67, it became much more conspiracist under the influence of Soviet propaganda. But yes, it's there. But I think part of the reason it was so interesting for me to be on this panel is that, you know, it's not just unidirectional kind of influence. You know, there is definitely, I think it's a two-way street between what was going on in Moscow and the Arab states in terms of what's being developed, what is being put out, what slogans, what tropes are being put out. So it's complex, I think, what we're facing.
You talked yesterday about it in the panel when you presented, and I wanted to say, and I didn't say yesterday, you talked about one of the countries that was linked with this Arab nationalism, Cuba, I think you talked about Cuba, or?
Cuba definitely.
Cuba, yeah, because it was interesting, because if we look at today what is happening after October 7th, I was just a week ago, I was walking in the street and I looked at one of the Palestinian protests, and they had a Cuba sticker. So I asked them, what is the link? Because of my research, I tend to, you know, engage inside this protest, and I go in and ask questions. So I asked, and then they showed me that there is a club, actually Cuba's debate club, that they do together with the Palestinians. And the rest of the story is what I saw further, I will tell you, but I think it relates, you see how history is reflecting on the present.
That's exactly right, which is why we're all at this conference. I want to join what John said. Thank you all so much for being here and staying this late and asking great questions. Thank you.